Panel 4. Depictions of blindness in comics. Image: a black and white drawing of superhero character Daredevil with a target as the background. Text: Depictions of blindness in comics. Panel Moderator: Anil Lewis. Panelists: Joe Stretch A. Jose Alanas. M. Sabine Rear.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. If you've been with us for the full day, thank you so much for enjoying a full day on this topic. I know I am, and I hope it has been the same for you. If you're just now joining us, a few access notes. You can, if you want to be able to personalize the captions a bit, you can also access them at tinyurl.com/longmorecaptions. We have chat turned off, except for a few key information you need, but please use the Q&A as if it's a chat room. Many people have been asking throughout the day if that will be shared afterwards. It will be shared with everyone, so you can go back in, get those resources, spend more time in there if you want. Let's see, we also have a Facebook group set up, and that should be a space where after today you can continue to make conversations and collaboration happen. That can be found at facebook.com/groups/comics A11Y. And we also have a Twitter hashtag for today, and that's #comics A11Y. With that, we are now turning to a really important topic. We spent the day talking about the different ways that we can think about making comics accessible. But now we have to ask, why would we want to access comics if the depictions of blindness in them are offensive and outdated? And so we're going to explore what it looks like to make them better from lots of folks who've been thinking about this for some time. So I'm very grateful to our panelists. With that, I'd like to ask Anil to turn on his video, and we will pass it to you. Thank you, Anil.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Full disclosure, I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind. That's not the disclosure. The disclosure is I'm not a comics aficionado. So I accepted this responsibility because of the respect that I have for Ting for a long relationship. And I think that she had an ulterior motive in inviting me to moderate this panel because it has sparked an interest that did not previously exist. And I've been able to sit in some of the presentations throughout the day. And I think that there's a lot of potential in leveraging this to promote some more programs throughout the organization. So it's really been interesting and a very good learning process for me. I briefly had an opportunity to talk with our panelists, and I think that you, like I, will find their perspectives very enlightening, hopefully very encouraging with respect to what we can do through this particular medium. Before I go to the introduction, I need to say my name is Anil Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind. I'm a Black male in my late 50s. I have a shaved head, salt and pepper mustache with a goatee. And I wore my orange polo shirt today because that was the most vibrant color that I have in my conservative wardrobe when I was thinking about trying to be vibrant for this discussion of comics and graphic novels. So it is indeed my pleasure to introduce or allow this distinguished panel to introduce themselves. And what I'll do is I'll start by allowing them to tell you who they are, their credentials, but I also want to steer this in the beginning with a question. So as you go and introduce yourselves, I want you to answer the question, why do we even bother trying to worry about making this very visual medium accessible to blind individuals? And I think that that will bring us into a space where we can start talking about the depiction of blindness within that medium. So we're going to start with, let's start with, now I have Sabine as Jaws is pronouncing your name, but is it Sabine?
Yes, it's Sabine. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Not at all. I can definitely get us started. Thanks very much, Anil, and I'm really excited to get to participate on this panel and speak with all of you. My name is Sabine Rear. I am a blind cartoonist. I'll give a quick description of myself. I'm a white woman in my late 20s with brown hair cut into a sort of a grown out quarantine mullet. I'm sitting in my living room, which is white walls, and there's a big window behind me. I'm not sure what color my shirt is, and I'm wearing glasses that have kind of a pink tint to them. A little bit about me and my work. As I said, I'm a cartoonist, so I make primarily autobiographical short comics and zines about my experience with blindness, public space, gender, and sort of navigating multiple identities in shared public spaces, art spaces, things like that. I also make comics about pro wrestling and whatever I want. And I like to talk a lot about being a blind person making comics, and blindness sort of being a part of my art process and practice, as well as sort of the way I approach the media that I take in. So in that way, I'm really excited to talk about this with our wonderful panel. I'm also, I'm an educator. I teach the comics portfolio program here in Portland at the Independent Publishing Resource Center. I'm an organizer with the Portland Zine Symposium, and I'm a pillar of the local karaoke community during times when karaoke exists. Thanks very much for having me.
Sure. So why do we bother?
Why do we bother? That's right. There was a question. Why do we bother? So for me, what the question is answered by sort of my interest in making this work, right? Why do I bother making a visual medium as someone with low vision? And then why do I make it about myself, right? So I think those things are tied together for me. I will say that I don't see myself reflected in a lot of visual media, and particularly in comics. We're going to talk about that, I think, as we move through the questions that you've prepared for us. And I find it really empowering to bother, to bring myself into that visual space, and to engage with the aspects of visual media that I find interesting. And then in terms of characterization, I think we not only want to see ourselves in media, but we don't want to see ourselves misrepresented. So we want to be talking about who's in the room making what choices about whose story gets told. And I think that's a really important part of what we're going to talk about today.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The next gentleman I'm introducing, I consider him a friend of many, many years, who has moved kind of away from the focus in blindness, but really into a different way where he brings his expertise and lived experience to create opportunities for blind people that otherwise wouldn't exist. So Joe Strechay, why don't you tell our attendees a little bit about who you are and tell them why you think we bother.
Awesome. Thank you, Anil. It's so great to be on here. And I think of you as a friend and someone I look up to in general, truthfully. I'm a co-executive producer for Apple TV Plus's C. And I've been a producer on this show for 3 seasons. I've also worked on other streaming television shows, including Marvel's Daredevil on Netflix, the OA on Netflix, worked in production, in books. So for Scholastic, there's a series called Dragon Masters, where I worked on a book called The Call of the Sound Dragon, where I helped with helped the writer with the story and around the blindness aspects, but also I helped with the illustrations. So describing what the illustrations and even modeling some things for the illustrations in the book. And I've worked in theater and other productions, but a lot of my work is spent around creating accessibility and inclusion in the film world, but I also get to block every scene in the TV show, the streaming television show I work in. So, and on a visual medium, and I have no sight anymore. My vision I lost over a number of years, and I'm totally blind now. I've gone through a period where I had low vision back in the day, and grew up reading comics, and comics were important to me, and characters. And when I first learned that I was losing my vision, and I was seeking in media, and what I was looking for, and I wanted cool people that are cool and doing things and active and out there in the world. And I love to hike and be out there in the world and do all kinds of things. And I didn't see that in the media. And my undergraduate work is around communications and media, where we studied like the impact of media. And then my graduate work is around blindness, around orientation mobility. So how to travel with white cane and the guide dog, and but also teaching children and adults daily living skills and life skills. And I kind of feel like I've become full circle, but I get to impact the media that's out there. And I echo what's been mentioned before. And I think we're getting closer and closer to getting the voices of persons with disabilities able to actually have their voices out there. You know, I didn't create my show that I work on, but I get to block every scene in our show. You know, I don't make every decision, but I try my best to make sure my voice is heard. And then also to make sure that we're bringing on numerous people who are blind or low vision, and then them also getting to impact the story and what lives on the screen and lives in the story every day. So.
Nice. I think you kind of wove in an answer through that narrative, so I appreciate that. This next gentleman, when we were prepping for this particular panel, just impressed me with his whole historical perspective of the portrayal of people with disabilities in comics and graphic novels. So Jose, if you could introduce yourself to our attendees and then tell us why you think we bother trying to make such a visual medium accessible. If you're speaking, Jose, you're still muted. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, you know, you don't teach on Zoom for a couple of months and you just forget everything. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you don't use it, you lose it. Yeah, that's just the reality of life.
Use it or lose it. Ain't that the truth? So my name is Jose Alanis, and I am a professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Washington in Seattle. I also teach comparative literature studies, and I teach a lot about comics, and I've written a couple of books about comics, including the representation of people with disabilities in superhero comics. In terms of what I look like, I am a Mexican-American man in his early 50s. I have salt and pepper hair and beard. I wear glasses. I have my my regulation checkered shirt as a Gen Xer issued at birth. And I also pairing it today with a Chapulín Colorado t-shirt that I got in Mexico, a notable Mexican superhero. I am in what is usually one of our cats' rooms. So you'll see a number of items that are cat specific, including some toys and a kind of a tower for them to jump around on. So that's what I am. We're also, I wanted to acknowledge that I am coming to you guys from the Key Peninsula in the Pacific Northwest. This is the traditional home of several tribes of the Coast Salish peoples. We are also now undergoing a terrible heat wave, the second of the summer. So we're all trying to keep cool and trying to keep our animals alive out here in rural Washington. So let me also begin by saying that it is such an honor and such a rare privilege for me to be the one person with normate vision on this panel. It is, I think, a testament to the thoughtfulness of the organizers and how important an event like this is. Why is it worth it? Why should we look at this material? I think the panelists that came before me have already articulated, I think, an important part of that. I guess I can add that it's important to look at our history, to look at the ways that blind people have been represented in comics. And so what I hope to do today is to look at one particular example based on an article that I've just recently completed on Alicia Masters, who is a prominent character in the Fantastic Four series, who happens to be blind. And what comes through in the depiction of this character over the decades is the association, the linkage often made between femininity and weakness and dependence, as well as with blindness, and how all of these things kind of intersect in this character pretty much throughout the first 3 decades of its history. And then more recently, how younger artists, younger creators have tried to take that inheritance, which is highly problematic, and try to revise it and try to approach this character in new ways, in my opinion, sometimes carrying over some of that problematic content, and in other cases, I think breaking important ground and resulting in what is ultimately, I think, a more empowering representation.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to digging a little deeper in that. Some of the things that you shared during our briefing were really impressive, and some things I hadn't even considered. So one of the things that made me interested in moderating this particular panel is all about intersectionalities now. And I know as an African-American male growing up in this country, I can reflect back on how African-Americans were portrayed in the media. And I remember as a sighted person, I became blind when I was 25. I used to enjoy the comics too. We had this cute little thing where you would take the white crayon over the comic strip and then you put it on top of a piece of paper, and you could take a pencil and transfer that comic to whatever piece of paper you wanted. So we created comics using comics. We recycled them and made our own comic strips. But I'm happy to know that I can probably move back into that space where I can enjoy comics again. But I remember seeing my first Black superhero in the comic strips and the impact that it had on me, and the intersection of understanding why this is important with respect to the appropriate portrayal of people with disabilities. Because in some media, there wasn't the most positive portrayal of Black people on stage, on screen, et cetera. So I'm going to go to Sabine, who I continue to be impressed with respect to the fact that she has commitment to this as a art or communication form that is an authentic representation of who she is. So one of the things that the National Federation of the Blind is fighting for in broader media is that in those instances where a character within film, stage, and comic strips even, is portrayed by a person with a disability. There's plenty of talented individuals like yourself who are able to do that. Can you speak to why it's so important that it's the person with the disability representing that disability or creating that experience that's portraying the person with the disability?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that question. And I guess where I'll start with that is because the work that I'm making is centered around my own experience, I have a lot of freedom from the feeling that I need to represent blindness in aggregate, knowing that the blind experience is, like many marginalized experiences, not monolithic, right? And is my experience is an additive intersectional experience of my selfhood as a blind and queer woman, as a white woman coming from the background that I come from, right? I get to represent that in a way that works for me. Comics are a unique medium in terms of the way in which, I think this has been discussed at length here, but we show and tell. And for me, as someone with some limited vision, my ability to show is nicely bracketed by what vision I have and what I like about that. My interest in making really visually clear, striking, high contrast comics is a part of the way in which I think about representing blindness in general, both my relationship with the sight that I have and my relationship with myself as a blind person in public space. I'm going to try really hard to keep my answers to comics because I think there's people on this panel with different relationships to blindness in different spaces, and I want to speak as directly to the kind of comics I make as I can. And I think anyone can make a comic. It's a sort of like writing a book, right? There are varying degrees of access that we have to success or levels of publication or canonization, but inherently it's a medium that is you sitting down with what you're going to make. And I think that's kind of a special medium to me because the roadblocks that we set up between people with disabilities and access to a sense of success in their chosen medium are boundless, right? And so for me to be able to sit down and work in the medium of my choice and to see the vision that I have not as a barrier to me making that thing that I want to make, but as a boundary around the aesthetics that I find interesting, I find that really powerful, and that's something that really makes making comics fun for me. I also really like that the kind of comics that I make, I make the majority of my zines by hand. I bind them by hand. There's a lot of tactile experience there, and there's a lot of community there. I find lots of people with different disabilities are active in the community of comics and zines that I find myself in, and that we wind up doing a lot of work around collective access for each other. So I really try to provide access to my work in a flexible way where people can tell me what they need to engage with my work, and I can make that happen in a conversational way, knowing that we all have, only so many tools at our disposal, and many of our access needs bump into each other and require kind of creative solutions to navigate.
Nice. Just as a follow-up based on what you just said, do you find that in that interaction, in that give and take, that there's an organic learning that takes place between you and your contemporaries that maybe enlightens them about people with disabilities and how they're being portrayed in that medium, in this medium?
Absolutely. I think that also my desire to make comics about my experience comes a lot from being read a lot of different ways in public and wanting to communicate the way I think about myself versus the way I'm read. And then, so what I really want is to be able to make that legible to community members who want to engage with what I'm making. And I don't often know off the top of my head how to make a comic accessible in the best way for someone who wants to engage with it. And so, yeah, it's been moments where someone is willing to really collaborate with me in terms of their access and my understanding have been really powerful.
Nice. But I'm sure that takes place after they get over the impact of this blind, low vision individual actually doing comics. So you have to have a skill set to put them at ease with the fact that you have that professional capacity.
Sure. Yeah, that's always a question I'm willing to speak to, but I try to move quickly through it, right? Because I also think it's important to talk about how not all, we culturally like to speak in absolutes, which means that a lot of the access I'm provided as a blind person is based on the assumption that I have no sight, which is not helpful to me. And may not always be helpful to blind people with different types of sight or no sight, right? So I think that's why I find that conversational aspect and that collaborative aspect really important when we talk about access, because I know that when I'm offered the default access for blind people, it's not always what I'm looking for. And I know that's true for other folks trying to access my work as well.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So to my friend Joe, you mentioned in some correspondence you shared with me that you're knowledgeable of the migration of portrayal of minorities in the media, and you were associating that with blindness in the same. Can you share that with the attendees here, what you mean by that?
Yeah, definitely. During my undergraduate work, we studied different populations and how they migrate into mainstream media. And there was the original study was done in 1969 by Clark, specific, and then it's been replicated for different populations. It started with race and then moved on to like LGBTQI plus populations. And I read about it in a cognitive psychology of mass media by Sandler, or edited by Sandler. But this study basically, or this information or this research breaks it down to 4 stages. First, non-existence, like populations are non-existence in mainstream media or in media. Then moves to ridicule, so being made fun of, made a joke, used as humor, kind of slapstick, all the above. After that point, it moves into regulation. And regulation might not be what most people think about, but if you look at a lot of media and you look at different populations, how they're first represented in media in a somewhat respectful way, they're provided parts and often professions that automatically give them respect, like judge, lawyer, police officer, all these types of roles that bring authority. So they put these populations into those roles. And I think you can look back at many roles. After that regulation stage, we move into a full range of roles and respect. And I would say in disability realm, we're not there yet. I think we're just cracking the door open and just kind of forcing the door open in that realm. But there are definitely some big bounds being made, or maybe just those are normal size bounds being made. But you can look back through all kinds of different populations and kind of look through those stages and see how they attribute. And I definitely see it in the world of blindness and in those portrayals, but also how the parts for actors who are blind or low vision. And you know, I've worked with, I don't know, close to, 60 actors professionally, like in film, who are blind or low vision in parts and roles and, you know, in television and such. And I've worked with hundreds who have auditioned and gone through the process. And I get to, for my show, I get to review every audition that comes through. The showrunner for our show and myself review every audition that when we break down the parts to figure out who is the best person for that part. And there are always people who are blind or low vision in that realm. And but sometimes they're not the right person for the part. But yeah.
Yeah. So you answered the question that inspired me. You say we're not quite at stage 4 yet. So I'm assuming you feel we're at stage 3.
I would say we're in stage 3. Like,
so what is it going to take to get us to stage 4?
I think like the door is opening. And if you look at even other populations, not just the disability community, I would say the LGBTQI plus population is still not totally in a full range of roles. Like it's getting there. It's a lot further along than the disability community, but the disability community has a lot farther to go. And I think I think getting the voices of persons with disabilities, persons who are blind or low vision, who get their own shows or creating their shows, writing their shows, where they're leading that show is the most important thing. And I know people doing that. I know people, a director and writer who created a feature film out of the UK, Adam Morris. I know other people who are legally blind who've just been greenlit on TV shows, and it's happening, but we're just not there yet. And I think the more success you see from those people, the more they get to represent the full range out there, and they're creating that narrative. And it doesn't even just have to be about disability or blindness, but it's nice to have some of that perspective in the world, in those parts they're creating or the stories they're telling.
Mm-hmm. So do you think we'll get to stage 4?
I think so. I think so. I think we still have a ways to go. I think I can tell you my foot's in the door, and I feel like I'm going to have some opportunities. I know others who have opportunities who are going to be able to, and if we can help other people get those opportunities, I think that's so important. And I forgot to say, I'm a white male with a beard, a thick beard. I have long hair that goes down to, I guess, my chest. I have a t-shirt on, and I have no clue what color it is right at the moment. And I have a horrible mask tan from being outside in the sun every day. Yep.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So Jose, it seems like Joe has kind of provided the schematic of those 4 stages. And with your expertise and all the research you've done in the portrayal of people with disabilities in comics, can you share with our participants some of the things that you've learned? And can you share whether the portrayal of people with disabilities has progressed through those stages that Joe kind of outlined?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I'm trying to share my screen since I did have some images. So let's see if that works.
It says you're sharing your screen.
Is that coming through?
Hi, Jose. Yeah, I can see that. It's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay, thank you. Let me put this up here. So you should be seeing an image of Alicia Masters from Fantastic Four. Hopefully that'll queue up if it hasn't. So yes, thank you, Anil. Indeed, I think Joseph sets up a very useful.
Let me interrupt you just really quickly. Can you give kind of an audio description of what's on the screen? Because I can't see it, and I'm not.
Yes. So what you see on the screen is a drawing of a woman who is blonde and sitting in a studio. She is an artist, and she has a bust of a superhero named Ben Grimm the Thing next to her. And it is an image of Alicia Masters, who I will talk about just now. But I wanted to appreciate Joseph setting up those parameters. I would say that those 4 stages don't necessarily operate in discrete kind of order, right? Like you can have some of them overlapping. You can have sometimes, going backward as well as forward. It's kind of like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and death, right? Like they don't necessarily operate in any kind of necessarily sequence. But of course, the general mode is to go in the attitude of progress. Alicia Masters was introduced in 1962 in the Marvel superhero series, The Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four, as you probably know, was a central pillar in the Marvel revolution of the early 1960s, the so-called Silver Age. And so one of the characteristics of that era was, and one of the innovations that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee introduced at that time was putting in more people with disabilities, including the major characters. Alicia Masters is not one of the major characters, but she is the romantic interest of one of them, Ben Grimm, the Thing. And she is introduced in 1962, as I say, as the blind daughter of a supervillain. I'm not going to go into all of the different details, but as you can see here in this image from, or as I'm showing on the slide, in this image from 1962, she is portrayed as a kind of weak person. In this page, she is trying to prevent her father, the villainous puppet master, from his schemes. And she basically is shown stumbling into him and inadvertently causing him to fall out of a window. So there's almost an element of pratfalling kind of vaudevillian comedy that is baked into this sequence. She is not represented as any kind of a powerful figure, even though of course she defeats the villain. It's more of a bumbling kind of demeanor that she is presented with. So the association, right, as Joseph pointed out earlier, of representing these marginalized groups as objects of ridicule or objects of pity was very much in operation at this early time. Now that said, right, there is an important element here that Kirby and Lee are introducing, which is that we are able to actually enter into their representation of what an independent artist who happens to be blind is like. There's another element of Alicia Masters' representation, and you can see it here in this image from that I have on the slide, which is showing Alicia Masters' sculptures, which are sculptures of various Marvel villains, including the Mole Man, who is a man with distorted features, who also, by the way, happens to be blind. Dr. Doom, who is a man in armor, and some Skrulls who are alien creatures. And they're all being gazed over by the Fantastic Four, 3 members of the Fantastic Four, in this issue, in this image from January of 1963. And they point out that Alicia is such a remarkably sensitive artist and person because of her blindness, that she is actually able to represent these fearsome villains in particularly almost frightening, lifelike ways, as they are described. There's of course a kind of paradox here, right? How could Alicia actually represent these figures if she could not physically touch them? But it gets at, again, the kind of the absurdity of some of these portrayals, that she is so sensitive that she can almost telepathically channel these figures' appearance into her work as a sculptress. Finally, before I pause, I wanted to show just one important facet of the character, given that in arguably the most important story of the 1960s in the Marvel series, The Fantastic Four, the series that introduces Galactus and the Silver Surfer, it is left to Alicia, not the superheroes, but Alicia, to save the planet Earth. And so you see here 2 panels from the Fantastic Four, number 49, April 1966, which shows Alicia, the blonde woman, pleading with the Silver Surfer by kind of banging on his chest and pleading very close up to his face for mercy for the planet Earth, because she feels that they have no right to take away their planet, since their intention is to destroy the planet. And at one point she says, "We live, breathe, feel. Can't you see that? Are you as blind as I?" So I guess the most generous thing you can say about this type of representation is that it kind of cuts both ways. It gives obviously a very incomplete and very skewed image of Alicia as a weak and even simpering figure. At the same time, it instills her with such humanity, if you will, that she is able to represent the entire planet Earth in the face of destruction, and actually succeeds in saving the planet Earth. All of this is part of the contradictions and paradoxes that are often involved in superhero comics.
Yeah, and also very reflective of real life, right? I mean, it's not as easy as we would think. Life is complicated, and living as a person with a disability, a lot of those juxtapositions come into play in every day.
And the important thing, of course, and this is obvious, is that this is a sighted culture's representation of a blind person. That's, of course, that's the problem.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So Joe, I'm going to come back to you. Sabine mentioned earlier, and I love the fact that she's just so authentic, right? She's representing herself in her work. But you just listed a whole body of collaboration where it's not about Joe Strechay as the blind guy. So as you're consulting on these different projects, how do you balance not making every depiction of blindness based on your lived experience? Because, you know, within the category of blindness, there's so many different individualized lived experiences. How do you balance that?
That's a great question, Anil. Well, basically, my graduate work is around blindness. I've basically like 3 masters around blindness. I've worked in multiple states where I taught people how to travel, people who are blind or low vision, in New Jersey, in New York City. I taught children or high school students in New York City who are blind or low vision, state of Florida as well, and worked at Florida State University. And I've worked with about, I don't know, 1,000 or thousands of people who are blind or low vision. I played a Paralympic sport where I was worked with a lot of people, or played sports with other people who are blind or low vision. But so I've worked professionally with people who are blind or low vision. I've also had the lived experience. My mom is also blind as well. You know, so I don't use just my experience, but I also do the research. So when I'm talking about a specific portrayal, I look at the age of vision loss, if they lose their vision or if they were born blind. I look at that. I work on the science around it through all the journal articles, thinking about what those implications would be specific to that character. Every character that I work with, whether it was the child version of Matt Murdock, because Matt Murdock lost his vision around 9 or 10 years old, you know, that helped me determine what the portrayal of Matt Murdock in the Netflix show would be like. It wasn't specific to the comic book. It was specific to the research. And then when you look at Britt Marling's character in the OA, I specifically looked at the age of vision loss in the show I work on now, which is, you know, it's totally science fiction. Viral apocalypse happens somewhere between now and maybe 100 or 200 years from now. And wow, viral apocalypse, that could never happen, right? So this virus happens and kills off the majority of population of Earth. And the people that live emerge blind. And then our show takes place hundreds of years out later as different civilizations have built out, and you'll see more of that in August 27th when season 2 comes out. And I'm currently working on season 3.
Spoiler alert there.
Yeah. More to come. But and you know, in our current show, the social norms and visual and cultural norms of eye contact disappear after hundreds of years of not having sight. And in a world where the value of sight is non-existent, eye contact disappears. If you go to different parts of the world, currently, eye contact is valued in different ways. So I took things like that and built it into our show. And so it's what I use is often research-based, you know, but also depending on the storyline. I'm not writing all the stories, but as we move through this process, my experience and experiences of others, like when people are climbing mountains or cliffs, I call my buddy Eric Weinmeier, and he sends me videos of his climbing. And I have some other friends in Europe who are climbers who are totally blind. And you know, when I have people who are doing very specific things, it's just not only my perspective. And I have a core group of people I reach out to here and there when I have specific questions to make sure. And it's a very diverse group, I would tell you. of people that I reach out to, because I want to make sure I'm not just representing myself. And I do have to make decisions about what it'll be and try to justify them and explain them. And I know I'll be asked about them. So I take it very seriously. It's a big responsibility. And, you know, and our actors who are blind or low vision that come into each one of our seasons have their opportunity to bring their spin to that world, you know? Yeah.
Great. I'm going to come back with the follow-up, but I want to go to Sabine as kind of a juxtaposition. So representing yourself does give you that ability to say that this is my lived experience, but I got to believe that sometimes you run into other blind or low vision individuals that either, you know, can resonate with what you're putting out there or say that this is not a true, authentic blind experience. Does that happen to you? And if so, how do you deal with that?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess I'll start by saying, like, for me, it's important that I call myself blind, and I don't mind being referred to as low vision, but I don't really like to allow too much space for people to adjudicate my experience of visual processing as a part of whether my experience is or isn't legitimate. And so that piece of language is important to me. I will say no blind person has ever like consumed my work and told me that I wasn't really blind, right? That is something that sighted people do with regards to my work for sure, and bring sort of to my doorstep this question of why and how I might make visual work or visually focused work as a blind person. And I have some space to speak to that, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. One thing I will say is that with regards to what was discussed around the sort of evolution of representation and the ways in which we kind of hope to see people with disabilities portrayed versus how they are portrayed, I think people with disabilities are sort of uniquely stuck in fiction in being portrayed as symbols. Maybe more so than any other group, right? We see the symbolic absence. As a culture, we're very interested in the symbolic absence of a sense or an ability as being a literary device. And that's a big reason why I make nonfiction. I feel I have a lot more control over what I'm trying to say and what I know. And it allows me to give sort of what I feel is a truthful account of my experience without getting bogged down in blind person as all-seeing seer, right? Like these tropes that we see coming up with disabled bodies in fictional media, perpetrated by able-bodied creators, but also, you know, just sort of generally adopted in ways that I think are pretty pervasive and pretty difficult to unpack. I find nonfiction to be a good side door where I can be focused, not on like truth telling, right? I made some air quotes there, but just on focusing on what I know and what I find interesting about my own experiences and the experiences of people I feel comfortable speaking for and about, versus allowing myself to be sort of subsumed by this narrative of the symbolic value of a blind person in a fictional narrative.
So I'm going to ask, because you touched on this too, I'm asking you and Joe to kind of expound on when you're dealing with people's perception of your authentic representation of people with disabilities. I mean, that's got to be challenging, right? Because you're dealing with the historic perception, you know, that people exist. It's reinforced through our everyday with people living with those misconceptions around, you know, the capacity of people with disabilities. And now you're in this place where you're trying to justify that you are an authority. It seems like it would be kind of obvious since you are an actual person with a disability, but I got to believe it's a little bit more difficult than that.
I think actually what Jose talks about with regards to Alicia Masters and her impact on interpretations of blindness overall, and sort of the historical moves that we have or haven't made around interpretations of blindness, that shows up in my real life with regards to my work quite a lot, right? So when we see lots of representations of blind women as objects of pity, as sort of nice bringers of truth with relation to the very vulnerable, or as like a representation of the most sort of pure or pitiful body you can imagine. And again, Alicia Masters also, if you are not sighted while we're looking at those images, is like conventionally beautiful. So all of that information wraps up in a cultural imaginary of what a blind woman is. And that's something that I'm bumping up against when I make work, right? And I'm very aware of that. And I don't find it particularly interesting to address that head on. I have things that I'd rather talk about in my work, I think, but I'm aware of it. And I think part of what comics lets you do is be in conversation with the whole medium of comics while being very specific with your style and your narrative choices about what parts of it you want to take in and what parts of it you'd like to leave behind. And so I think knowing that there's that history, right, of portrayals of blindness, and particularly blind women, people who are blind being totally blind, things like that, that's all subtext for the work that I'm making. And I have to kind of either directly or indirectly take that on when I think about work that I'm making.
Right. So I imagine it's a skill that you have to acquire if you're going to be successful in the work that you do. But based on, Joe, based on what Sabine was just offering, all of that, you know, the portrayal of people with disabilities in the media enters the room long before you do, right? So all those other people that are working with you in conjunction to put this work together come to the table with that pre-existing perception. How do you deal with it?
So I get to choose my work, right? Like, so I have the opportunity to choose what I work on. And, you know, I will only work on a project where I believe the people and the properties are respectful to blindness. And, you know, they're not all created equal. There are so many projects that I've been provided scripts to or asked to consult on, and that I read through it and I provide my feedback, and possibly they don't like my feedback, or I'm just like, there's no way I want to be any part of this project. You know, most are created by people who are not blind or low vision, have had very little interaction to people who are blind or low vision. And then the stories have all kinds of narratives that are just mistaken. And just in that ridicule world, even I come across comedies and other things, and I'm like, I do not want to be a part of that. That's not the story I want to help tell. I want to make sure that we're shown, like for my show and our show that I work on for Apple TV Plus C, you know, we do have some of those more common, like special abilities in some ways, but I would say it's a science fiction show, as I keep saying. But also, I would say that we have people that are warriors, villains, romantic interests, that are parents, doing all kinds of professions. And you don't see people doing professions. Persons with disabilities, persons who are blind especially, you don't see them doing jobs, everyday life, like carpentry. You don't see them doing metal work. You don't see all of that. And I've been able to, in my show, to bring in people who actually really do that work, to do stuff on our show, be part of our show, whether portray it, but also, you know, to represent that, because I want to see that in the world, and we don't see it. Think about all the portrayals you see in the media and what activities you see those people do. It's very limited, and that means something to me. If I have the opportunity to work on a project where I can show people who are blind doing stuff that most people don't think about or don't believe, and it's funny because some of the people who I know who are blind or low vision talk to me. They'll say, "You're not the typical person who's blind." Like I do rock climbing and bouldering. I'm like, I know so many more people that are like, you know, Eric and other people who climb all the time. You know, I can do a little climbing. I'm not Eric or these other people, but like to say, because I go hiking and go through nature, and I'm willing to put, and Anil, you're definitely one of those people, and I'm sure every one of us on this is one of those people. But It's funny how many of the people in our own population and community have bought into what limiting factors has been presented about us over the years.
Yeah. what typical quote unquote.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come to you, Jose. Again, Sabine offered another interesting dynamic. She says she likes to focus on nonfiction. Have you, in your research, seen a difference as to whether the portrayal of people with disabilities is offered better in non-fictional or fictional works?
Yes, thank you. I'm once again trying to share my screen. Is that showing up for you all?
Yep, thanks, Jose.
Thank you. So yes, there is, I think, a difference, and that's what I think is important about studying the histories of these characters, that they don't stay static, and that, of course, in the case of Alicia Masters, who has been around almost 60 years, you do see changes over time. And so if you compare, for example, her representation in the 60s, pretty much throughout the 20th century, to what's going on in the last couple of decades, here's an example that I have on my slide by Dan Slott and Andrea DeVito from a series called The Thing from 2006. It shows Alicia Masters, a blonde woman, sitting in her bathrobe in a very, very palatial and pretty luxurious New York apartment. That's gotta cost a lot to have an apartment like that in New York City.
Alicia's
and
come up.
she's sitting at a breakfast table, and she is reading Braille. And you have a panel that shows her fingers tracing the Braille, and then you have a kind of additional panel, kind of a sub panel that gives you a visualization of what the Braille is saying. So this is, of course, still a comic book, obviously meant for a sighted audience, but you get some sense of her as a blind person doing something that is, typical and normal and living kind of an everyday life. One other thing that I was going to say, though, is that even as you look at some of these more recent representations that I will discuss in brief, you do still see some carryover. The idea that while Alicia Masters is independent, she is wealthy, she is living in this particular story apart from the Fantastic Four, because she and the Thing have broken up. And she has a whole other relationship. And so she's pretty much autonomous and lives her own life and lives a very fulfilled life. She is still represented through and this is something I think that came up when Sabine was speaking for me, is the visual typage, right, that occurs, the ways that there are certain visual markers of blindness that cartoonists to this present day have inherited. And it's always a choice, as Sabine was saying, whether one wants to kind of engage with those or wants to react against them. In the case of blind people, and in the case of Alicia Masters in particular, that visual marker of her blindness is signified by the blank irises. So she'll have these kind of blank eyes. Now that's different, by the way, from Matt Murdock, who is the other major blind character of the 1960s in Marvel, who's also Daredevil. His blindness is signaled by dark glasses. And I think, of course, there's a very strong gendered, obviously, approach here to what is going to be used for a man versus a woman who is blind. So, that continues right into the 21st century. On my next slide, I have a panel from a story from 2016 by Dan Slott and Mike Allred called Silver Surfer Volume 4, Citizen of Earth, which shows, again, I think another very, very different take on Alicia, who is no longer stumbling and bumbling. In fact, in this story, she is able to combat supervillains directly. We show her here confronting a supervillain who is floating in the air, another woman with a cape, and so as signified here by her blank irises, she is still blind, but she is holding on to her cane as a billy club. In fact, this is a cane that is given to her as a gift by Matt Murdock, her friend, who is of course also Daredevil, which can also be turned into a billy club like his weapon. So there's a lot of course, intertextual factors here to take into account. That said, right, there is also this recursive means by which she is being shown that actually ties into the long legacy of more dehumanized depiction of blind people in comics, because she is not staring directly at the villain. She is utilizing what the cinema historian Jason Chu calls the blind gaze. The blind gaze often being directed away from the main action, so to speak, right? And of course, this has particular ramifications for how she is seen as powerful or less empowered. Finally, I just wanted to turn to the very recent representation of Alicia Masters, because in 2019, she married Ben Grimm, the Thing, who is, of course, one of the founding members of the Fantastic Four. And so what you see, what you have on this slide here is a Jewish wedding, which we're shown Ben Grimm, the Thing, in traditional Jewish wedding dress with a yarmulke. He is about to smash the glass on the floor, and they're in a hufa there, and you see Alicia Masters in her wedding gown. And again, right, arguably this art by Carlos Pacheco is also highlighting what Jason Chu might call the blind gaze, in that she is looking off into what some might consider an irrelevant part of the space. So anyway, so there are all sorts of complexities, it seems to me, right? Alicia Masters is a modern woman. She has a career. She has all sorts of fulfillments in her life. At the same time, they're just in the ways that she is represented visually. There's still a lot of inheritances from the past that are being continued. Anil, you also asked about about nonfiction, and I just very briefly want to highlight one, I think, rather remarkable work, Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert, which is a biography of these two important women in the history of blind people in America. And it does really extraordinary things. So the cover shows Annie Sullivan, who is a young woman in her 20s, and the child Helen Keller sitting in a tree, and they are working on what looks like maybe some Braille, a book of Braille together. And this is, of course, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so what the book explores is, in particular, the sensation, right? The ways in which comics can find particular techniques and visual correlates to the experience of being a blind, deaf person like Helen Keller. And so in this final slide, you see a series of 8 panels in which Lambert depicts Helen Keller holding a glass of water. It shows a hand with a glass that says the word water, and how that glass in the next panel shifts into her head. And so the idea of her drinking the water and then having the concept of water in her head. The next panel shows the ways in which you can sign the word water in her head with the word water. So there's these associations being made between language, perception, and her particular ontology and subjectivity as a blind person. And so the page goes on to kind of make those connections very, very visually concrete in a way that's really unprecedented in comics. I will close simply by saying that there's, of course, a supreme irony here, and this is pointed out by Charles Hatfield, the comic scholar. There's a supreme irony in the fact that we are finding visual correlates for, of course, what is a non-visual idea, right? And so it is again part and parcel, right, of this particular approach of the representing the blind experience from a sighted perspective that, of course, runs us into maybe some of the problems that Sabine was pointing out before. Thank you.
Do you find it? Well, I can't say easier. I'll say more. Well, I can't say more in line with reality. So you just gave 2 examples of how disability is portrayed, one in a fictional context and the other in a non-fictional context. I would imagine, the nonfiction gives you license and ability to kind of imagine and project, where fiction gives you the opportunity, and nonfiction kind of maybe anchors you to trying to at least represent what is considered reality. Do you find that in the use of comics, one kind of serves us better when we're trying to promote that forward-thinking, proactive, positive perception of disability?
I think very briefly, I think comic, and I think actually this is a great question for the whole panel, but I think in the case of Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert, at least for me as a reader, I never forget the fact that, of course, these are real people. This is not a made up story. Of course, he takes dramatic licenses, and he's doing, and maybe the greatest dramatic license is to actually do these techniques where you kind of are creating these visual parallels to what is, of course, a very subjective experience of being deafblind. which is of course, completely from a sighted perspective, right? But yes, I think just the fact that if we're going to talk about representation, and we're going to talk about real people in American and world history who are blind, to just have them show up and to have them treated with such humanity, right, is really extraordinary. I can't recommend the book enough.
Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to pitch it back to the other members. So Sabine, you mentioned, fiction is your choice, right? So do you do that consciously because it gives you more freedom, or is the other alternative more restrictive?
I really like making nonfiction because I'm interested in the world and my place
Oh,
in
I'm
it.
sorry, I misinterpreted then.
Oh, that's
Nonfiction. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't fuck with fiction. I'm very happy for people who enjoy making it. I'm not particularly interested in building a world, and I feel like there are other hangups in fiction that I'm not particularly interested in engaging with, from the sort of symbolic disabled body that I talked about earlier to the construction of worlds. And I think something we've as a culture started to reckon with a little bit more lately, and this is a bit of a tangent, but like is the idea that like when we build fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds, we often reinscribe the same oppressive dynamics into those worlds. And I think a good example of that I think about a lot is an article, I don't remember its source now, around the time that Game of Thrones was popular, I'm going to reference sexual assault here, an article that was like, this is a fantasy world that includes dragons, and we can't imagine it not like just centralizing rape also, right? So for me, I consume plenty of fiction, but I'm not really interested in making it. And I am particularly interested in making visible the ways in which I interact with the world. I'm a very in public person. I have lots of jobs and lots of interests that take me lots of places. And I find that people, sighted and other disabled people, have a variety of reactions to me in public and a variety of types of interactions with me. I'm very interested in that. And so, knowing that, we all have multiple limited number of hours in the day, I like to spend my hours making that kind of work that interests me. Yeah. So yeah, my focal point is definitely on sort of locating the site at which my body and public space bump into each other, either literally or in terms of the way a space is designed, who's welcome in it, how I'm going to interact with the built environment or the community around me. That's where my interest sits for sure.
Thank you. So I guess the way I was framing the question for you is probably more appropriate to Joe, because you do end up in those areas where you have to imagine more, do more creativity, or build those worlds, like Sabine was saying. Do you find that to be more liberating, or is it more challenging? Do you base what you're doing on more a reality context?
I definitely use a lot of reality in my fiction, but I think it's both. It depends on what kind of story it is, who's telling the story, where the story's going, and but I use more reality to create that though, for the background. But then it depends where that particular story is going. Most of the stories I've worked on are fiction, and whether they are like more true life fiction or science fiction. I've done plenty of science fiction, obviously, but I like both. I like the creativity of fiction for sure. Like I like that we get to create aspects that are not written on the page originally, and or we get to expand what's written to show different things, and that excites me. But I love nonfiction as well. I read a lot, and there are definitely so many nonfiction stories that I would love to tell or help to tell in the future.
Yeah. I have to admit that the work in fiction, nonfiction, I just find it extremely creative. And I know that Sabine said anybody could do it, but I find myself woefully inadequate to do some of the things that we've already discussed. I'll offer this general question to the whole group before we open up for Q&A. And it's kind of nuanced because we've already kind of touched on it. But again, societal perception of people with disabilities, again, we're not at stage 4. And it's pervasive. I think that the majority of people, unfortunately, don't believe that people with disabilities have the capacity. They don't see us as contemporaries or as equals. And all of that comes into this space, you know, as we try to interact and try to produce and work in this space. How do we fight that? How do we, no, more specifically, in the realm of comics, a lot of what happens is, as Jose just portrayed, an interpretation of the panels, right? But if a person already has that pre-existing perception of incapacity, right? How do we keep them from interpreting our work from that ableist perspective? How do they get it? How do we make sure they get it? Maybe it's a little difficult. I'll offer some clarity. One of the previous panels, one of the ladies answered the question about when we're making comics accessible, we have to make them in a way that the information is presented so that the person who's reading it through that non-visual means is able to come to that epiphany or that conclusion, not be told what it means, but be able to come to that themselves. How do we do that when we're faced with that pre-existing ableist mentality?
I think, this is Joe, I think more and more having people whose authentic voice is out there, whether, you know, the individuals on these panels and on this panel and many other people I know out there in the world, getting more and more people to allow their voice to be out there and allow them to help create those stories and share them, whether in comics or any other kind of media. I think that's what's going to change perception, and right. and then getting the public to buy into that, you know, and the public to and I think that really, I think the media has an opportunity to change perception, but we're as you said, we're nowhere near there. We're maybe in stage 3, but just as said before, we go back and forth. Right. There's no straightforward.
Right. And then to offer a little clarity, the panel I was referring to then was like in the description of the comic, the panels in the comics, like the one that Jose was describing. Of course, he understands disability from a different perspective, so he can look at that picture and glean something, you know, in a way that we would want. But most people don't come from that pre-existing knowledge or perception that people with disabilities have capacity. How do we, and maybe it's not something that can be answered. Maybe this is more research that needs to be conducted, but I was wondering whether either of you had any ideas of how we do that.
If I can maybe offer something, I think in the case of a character like Alicia Masters, who has been around, like I said, since 1962, and who a lot of us grew up with reading Marvel comics, I think it can really affect, I think, at least some readers to see this character change and evolve, and the way that her representation is both reflecting, you know, a post-ADA maybe kind of culture in the United States, as well as maybe, you know, certain strides that feminism has made, and just certain things that are just not really, you can't really do Alicia Masters the way she was done in the 60s anymore, right? So I guess that's a sort of progress. Yeah. On the other hand, like I was trying to say, the picture is complex. The last thing I would say is that I think it would be remiss of me as a literature professor to not also point out that I don't think it's categories like fiction and nonfiction are necessarily discrete. I think very often they can blur into each other. Yeah. And one could say that
that was obvious based on me asking the question. It was obvious that it blurs.
Well, that representation, even self-representation, is a kind of recreation, right? It is a kind of, in a sense, putting on the page, which to me is, for Sabine, I think in your work, if I could just sort of slide a question in here, is whether there is a way in just your own practice, as you touched on, but just particularly in your own self-portraits, that you are grappling with the history of, you know, the cartoon representation of disabled people and of blind people in particular. I mean, I certainly think that you're challenging a lot of that in reverse flaneur and in the fashions that you kind of show yourself wearing, or the ways that you interact with people on the street, like flipping off a cat collar or something like that. So yeah, but I'm curious how you kind of came to these representations.
And an extension of that, is that your intent, and are you being intentional in
Yeah.
that work? Okay.
I sure am.
To change perceptions of people with disabilities?
I mean, maybe. So I think Jose is maybe, so thanks, Jose, for that really sweet question related to my work. And I think Jose is asking that question because he kind of knows the answer, which is that it's intentional on a personal level and sort of on a community level, right? Similar to what Joe brings up, like, I'm not trying to say that my experience of blindness is in any way representative of anybody's, but if someone's only idea of what a blind lady looks like is Alicia Masters, obviously that's not necessarily the case, but I think I'm often the only blind lady in the room, and I don't care for that. That's not ideal for me. That's not the world that I necessarily want to be in. And so one way in which I think I can deal with that is drawing myself looking cool, cruising around town, engaging with public space, engaging with the community, being creative, and maybe, like you say, fiction, nonfiction blurring, like being creative in the visual ways I represent the experiences that I have, and how I want to make it clear that the narrative that someone else might be projecting in terms of what they see of me in public is not the narrative that I'm experiencing, right? When we see someone on the street who is having an experience we don't understand, or embodying a disability that we can't imagine embodying, we make a lot of assumptions. And I think I grapple with my self-image in a fun way that I really enjoy, as a part of kind of talking about like one way in which you can see a blind person as a whole person. And I definitely also, like, as someone whose access to my self-image is limited to the vision that I have, I really enjoy drawing myself and thinking about the way that I look, and thinking about the control that I have over my own image when I draw myself. That's something that is really valuable to me.
Nice. Thank you very much for sharing that. I appreciate that. And I've been a bad moderator. You've
been great, but I think Jose had something.
This is Emily. I just want to make sure everyone knows.
Yeah, the Q&A. Yeah, we're coming up on time. That's what I was saying. I've been a bad moderator. I'm sorry. Let's try to take as many questions as we can. I think we have maybe 4 minutes.
You've been a wonderful moderator. Somebody asked, inspired by Jose's discussion of Alicia Masters reading Braille, does anyone know of an extended sequence in comics that depicts Braille reading? Wondering about sustained depictions of reading tactilely, actual depictions of reading with the fingertips.
I think that question was asked by Charles Hatfield, whom I mentioned earlier and whom I quoted. Apart from Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller, I can't think of any myself.
Not off the top of my head, but it could be out there. I'll keep an eye out.
Extended, I don't know extended, but in Marvel's Daredevil, definitely Matt Murdock reads Braille in the comics, but I don't know how we define extended, so I wouldn't say extended. It's probably like a frame or two.
Comics, yeah, are also very much about like getting information across in an efficient manner. Yeah. So just like you don't often see multiple panels of someone reading a book, I think it is probably unlikely, unless the subject of the work was on learning Braille or engaging with Braille. Sure. Like, we just don't see a lot of like pages of Matt Murdock reading or Spider-Man reading in whatever format.
As a Marvel zombie, I would also point out that because Matt Murdock is a superhero, has superpowers, he actually can read the actual newspaper with his fingers.
Sure. Daniel Kish can.
Another question that was asked was about how blind people, especially blind women, are often paired with some character that are viewed by society as aesthetically displeasing, like the Thing and Fantastic Four. The participant who raised it was saying that they really dislike that, but I'm wondering how you all feel about that. Is that a negative trait, or is that disability community?
Well, I'm not a panelist, but I went right to Beauty and the Beast, and she wasn't blind. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Maybe I'm dismissing.
No, in fact, well, this is a pretty archetypal, actually, a way in which Alicia Masters and Ben Grimm are paired. You can go back to the movie by The Man Who Laughs, which is a classic film of the 1920s that's adapting a novel by Hugo, which is with a blind woman and a grotesque kind of figure. I think that might have actually influenced Lee and Kirby's representation. I get into that in the article, but yeah, there is that's definitely Alicia Masters' purpose, in at least originally, is to have her provide sympathy for Ben Grimm, who is a monstrous, quote unquote, looking figure, by having her be blind, but also be able to see, his inner beauty.
Yeah, I think this is the question of, is it disability community? I think is a really good one, but I think also comes down to who's in the room and who's at the table, right? So it's one thing to say like, that could be disability community, and I am personally available to be arm candy for the Thing, but I wasn't at the table. And so what I see from that is similar to like, people are entitled to their own experiences. And I think for people with disabilities and people with experiencing various levels of marginality where media is often not made for us, we're in the habit of reading through, right? I think there's a lot that's talked about around like, certain dudes can just go to the movies and see their experience on the screen whenever they want. And lots of other people are in the habit of reading through text to find something that's useful for them. And sometimes that bumps up against someone else's interpretation. So like for me, I found the movie The Shape of Water really upsetting for similar reasons. The idea that a woman with a disability would only be appealing to a fish monster upsets me. And the ways in which that feeds into also like her own fantasies about able-bodiedness, I found that upsetting. Some other people found it really empowering. I'm not necessarily interested in adjudicating how that goes, but I think it is worth thinking about who's at the table when these stories are being told, and why we see so many of one type of story. Noticing those trends, I think, can tell you a lot about who is being used for what as a literary device as opposed to a full person.
Let me say that was very helpful for me. I appreciate you for sharing that.
Thanks. I'm glad.
So we are out of time. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, Anil?
I do not, but I did want to offer the panelists an opportunity to have a parting comment if we have the time. A very brief parting comment.
This is Joe. I'll say something brief. I'll just say, if you have the opportunity to give help someone who is a person who is blind or low vision, put their voice out there in an authentic way and allow them to share it. Please do.
Nice.
I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. And yeah, if you have the opportunity to let someone who's blind share their voice, you should pay them a lot.
Lovely. Can't top that. Thank you all. I enjoyed this. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
you, Anil.
Take care.
All right. Thank you all. And if your question was not answered, once again, we'll try to get that conversation going after this event, because there were still a few more that we didn't get to. To the panelists, go ahead and turn off your video. And at this time, we are hoping to get Chancey Fleet on. And she left and rejoined as panelist, but we don't see her yet. So, oh, there she is. Yay, perfect timing.